The time has come. We now build Hang Printer version 3. So here's how this is going to work. We're probably going to do this exactly like the version 2 build. We'll do one build video, then we'll do a calibration and first print video. After this build video is done, I'm going to send it to Torbjorn and see if there's anything that I missed, and I'll get an update out if I did. Normally when I do a build, I build it, make sure it works, then take it apart and build it again for the video. I'm not going to do it on this one. This is going to be a cold build, and I'm going to create the videos at the same time. So there might be some mistakes along the way, but I'll make sure to leave notes on the video so that you know where I messed up. So now let's not take up any more time. Let's get to building this thing. Here's all the printed parts you'll need. All the gray parts are PETG, and all the dark blue parts are PETG. The light blue parts are ABS because these either touch a motor or they're used on the extruder. You need 4 spool gears, 4 spools that go on top of those gears, 3 corner clamps, they go on the mover, 2 beam clamps, these go on the mover to hold the extruder crossbeam, 4 motor gears, 3 D-line rollers, 3 A, B, and C line rollers, 6 beam sliders, these go on the mover to tighten the line, 4 gear spacers, these go under these gears, under the bearing, 6 line rollers that go on the anchors, and a handful of cable clamps. I printed 10. 4 motor brackets, I printed these in ABS because maybe there might be some heat, an extruder holder, and then a ribbon cable clamp that goes on the top of this. You'll also want to print some sort of hot end / extruder body. For this build, I'm going to try to use a Prusa clone. It holds the hot end and the extruder motor and the gear. I'll leave a link to that in the description below. Here is all the non-printed parts. You're going to need 5 NEMA 17 stepper motors and their cables. You're going to need some ribbon cable to power the extruder and the hot end that are on the mover. This is 15 wire, 28 gauge, roughly 5 meters. You're going to need a ramp shield with 5 motor drivers. These are Clone 4988s. You're going to need a Mega board. I'm using a Clone Mega. You're going to need something to build the mover out of. I went with wood. These are 5/8 pieces. They're 40 centimeters long, and then the center brace for the extruder is 20 centimeters long. You're going to need a power supply. For this, I'm using a brick. It is 12 volt, 10 amp. You will need 8 608 bearings. You'll need 8 M8 washers. You'll need 8 M8 nuts and 4 M8 bolts. You'll need some assorted zip ties. I'm going to use 2 M3x30 screws to attach the Mega to the board. You'll need some Bowden tube. You'll need some type of hot end. I went with the Volcano Clone. You'll need fishing line. This is 30-pound test braided fused line. You need 12 623 V-groove bearings, roughly 20 M3x25 screws, let's say roughly 30 M3 nuts. You'll need some wood screws to attach your motor mounts to your board. I'm using number 10s, they're 3/4 inch in length. You'll need roughly 20 of those. You'll need some wood screws that are countersunk to attach your line rollers to the mounts. Roughly 20 of these. These are number 6 by 3/4 inch. You'll need roughly 20 M3x15 screws. These are to fix the V-groove bearings on the line rollers. Roughly 30 M3 washers. Around 20 M3x8 screws. 10 to 15 M3x5 screws. These are for attaching the gears to the motors. And around 20 M3x8 screws. These attach the motors to the mounts. Now let's talk about the extruder for a minute. I'm using the Prusa clone extruder, so I'm going to need 3 M3x30 screws, 2 5mm washers. I'm using a metal shaft that's 10mm in length, but you can also use a printed part. You need an MK8 extruder gear. You'll also need 1 625 bearing for the extruder cover. Again, you can use whatever type of extruder you want for this project. I just like this one. Other things you'll need for this build, you're going to need some wood for your build platform and to build the Hang Printer mover. I'm using 3/4 inch particle for this project. You can probably go with thinner stuff. This is just what I had. I recommend getting some DuPont connectors and a set of crimpers. This will make things much cleaner when we attach the extruder wires. I'm also going to use these elevator bolts and some 3/8 nuts so that the build platform will be adjustable and we can get it level. Also, you'll need a handful of wood screws to attach your mover. And you're going to have some scrap wood and some weight for your A, B, and C mounts. I'm just reusing the stuff from Hang Printer version 2. We'll start by putting the mover together. Again, I'm using 5/8 square stock. These are 40 centimeters in length. You'll need 3 of those and 3 of the printed mover corners. I'm using M3 by 25 millimeter screws to assemble them. These parts were scaled up 2% to allow me to fit the non-metric stock. You want to run the wood stock into the part so that it meets up with the inner corner of the part. There's one corner, then you'll put the screws through these holes. Tighten your bolts up just enough so it's snug on the square stock. Now that the mover's corners are on, we want to use it as a pattern on the build platform and on the ceiling printer plate. So trace the mover on both pieces of your wood. This is going to give you a location of where to avoid when we're putting our pieces to build the printer, as well as a location to where your home will be on the print platform. Now that we've traced the mover, we can add our extruder crossbeam. Again, this is 5/8 square stock. It's 20 centimeters long. It's going to go roughly in the center of the mover. These have been scaled up 2%, so they fit this size stock. Again, roughly in the center location, and we will bolt it with M3 25 millimeter screws. All the bolts are on. Again, no need to get crazy tightening these bolts. Just snug the plastic up to the wood. You don't want to break your plastic part. Now we'll attach 6 of these slide adjusters. These help you make the line shorter or longer when you're leveling your mover. They go on just like this. There's all 6. Then M3 25 millimeter screws to snug them up. Now the sliders are bolted up. Let's move on to building the extruder. Again, I'm going to be using the Prusa MK2 style extruder body. This is the same one that's been modified for the dolly build that will fit the MK8 style extruder gear. If you're going to use this setup, you're going to need a couple square nuts as well. One here, and one down here. Start by loading this center nut into the plastic piece. You're going to need a piece of Bowden tube that's roughly 47 millimeters. Put the Bowden tube into the hot end. Insert the hot end into the plastic part. Make sure there's a nut inserted into the extruder cover, and then put the front cover on. The cover will attach with an M3 by 25 here, and an M3 by 18 here. It'll meet up with this side square nut. I also forgot to mention that you'll need a couple of M3 by 40 screws and some springs for your extruder idler part. Take your metal shaft or your printed part, put it in your bearing, put M5 washers on either side, and load it into your idler. Your hang printer extruder mount will actually be sandwiched in between your extruder motor and your extruder body. So the mount will go like this, and then the body will go on top of that. This will be attached with M330 screws. We'll put these 2 screws in, and then this screw actually holds on the idler cover. Make sure your extruder gear is lined up correctly with your Bowden tube. You can use a piece of filament through the top to adjust it back and forth. Load your square nuts in the top. Take your M3 by 40 screw, put a washer on it, put your spring on it, and then another washer, and then load them into the idler cover. Do the same with the other screw. Now the extruder cover is on. At this point you could add a part cooling fan. I'm going to leave it off for now, but we might add one later. Now you can attach the hot end fan. It takes M3 by 18 screws. Hot end fan is on. Now you can attach your extruder body to the mover. It just clamps on the center beam like this. And you can clamp it in these holes with M3 25 millimeter screws. Now the extruder is successfully mounted on the mover. Now we'll move to extruder wiring. We're going to use ribbon cable to connect the mover to the ceiling plate. We're going to triple up the wires for the hot end. Everything else should be able to use just a single wire. We'll solder these 3 together for one side of the hot end. Then these 3 for the other side. Then we'll solder these onto the hot end wires and we'll add some heat shrink. Now we've got the hot-end wires soldered to 6 total ribbon cable wires. Now we'll take 2 of the ribbon cable wires and solder them to the thermistor. Got some heat shrink on those. We'll do the same for our fan wires. Fan wires are good. Now I'm going to sacrifice one of the motor cables and solder it to the ribbon cable for the extruder motor. Now I'll solder all the motor wires up. All the motor wires are done and heat shrinked. We'll run the ribbon cable through the top of the mover. You can plug your extruder motor in. Then the piece that prints out with the hang printer extruder mount is used to clasp the ribbon cable on the other side. We'll use M3 by 8mm screws. And at this point, the mover is pretty much complete. We can set it aside for now. Now we need to make some decisions on how the board's going to be laid out. We'll start by laying out the D-lines. The D-line idlers are going to be lined up with the corners of the mover, but you need a straight shot from the idler to the D gear. The lines can't interfere with anything else on the board. So I'm going to plan for my D spool to be in the top left corner. Now we need to know how to position the D-line holders to line up with the D lines. The easiest way to do this is to mount the D gear, attach the lines, and check the trajectories. Make sure that we're not interfering with anything else. So I'll trace the inside of the gear, and then put one of the 608 bearings on that trace mark, and trace the inside of that. Now I know where to put my 8mm hole. Now I'll drill the 8mm hole. I'm using a 5/16 bit, but that's really close to 8mm. Now we can put our bolt through. I'm going to use an 8mm fender washer on the bottom. You can go ahead and press your 608 bearing to the back of the spool. Remember to put your 3D printed spacer on top of that. Now you can put your actual spool on top of that with a 608 bearing, but it's actually easier to put the line on it first. So now we're going to measure out 5 meters times 3 for your D lines. Now that we have 3 5-meter lines, I'm going to tie them into the holes around the spool. Now that we have the 3 lines tied on the D spool, we want to wrap them around the spool. You want to keep them separate as much as you can with your fingers while wrapping. We're going to wrap these counterclockwise. Now the line is wrapped around the spool. We can put it on top of our spool gear. We'll put a 608 bearing in the spool. Now you can put your spool on top of your gear. Now you can put your washer on top of that, and your nut on top of that. Just make sure it spins freely. Now we'll take the D-line roller idlers and we'll insert the V-groove bearings. These are going to be attached with M3 by 18 screws. Now that the V bearings are in, we want to put some Teflon tube in the top of the D-line rollers. This helps guide the line to the floor. You just want to push it in far enough so it doesn't touch the V bearing. About 10mm of tube is enough. Now the tubes are in, we can mount them on our board. Now we need to move our D-line rollers so that they have a direct path to the D-line. The Bowden tube on top of the D-line roller also needs to line up pretty close to the hole in the mover. When you're happy with the positions and the line's nice and straight, you can put them on with your wood screws. Now the D-line rollers are in place. I'm going to do my best to show you the tourbillon trick for putting this line through the roller. So it's pretty hard to get these threaded from underneath, but if you make these a loop, and then you stick the loop through the top, you can push the loop through the bottom, and then take the end of the line and put it inside the loop, and then you can pull the loop back through. And then you have a threaded line. Once you have all 3 of your D lines threaded through the D line holders, just put some tape on them to hold them for now. With the D lines laid out, now we know where we need to avoid with our components. Before we start laying the board out, I'm going to go ahead and wrap the line around the A, B, and C spools. To start out, we're going to have 2 lines of 10 meters each. We can tie more in later if we need to. Since there's 2 lines on each spool, try to keep them separate with your fingers as you wrap them. We're going to wrap 2 of these counterclockwise and 1 of these clockwise. This is just to give us more flexibility with placement as we put them on the board. There's all 3 of the spools wrapped. Now we're going to do a rough layout of where everything should go. You have to make room for your motor mounts, your gears, your spools, your electronics, and your power supply. D motor mount will go roughly there. Let's call this the A line roller. Its idler will be roughly right here. Let's call this one the B line roller. Its idler will be right about there. We'll call this one the C line roller. And its idler we'll put right about there. The electronics and the power can go in this area. The motor cable should be more than long enough to reach all the locations. We'll go ahead and put the V-groove bearings inside the A, B, and C line rollers. Again, M3 18mm screws. There's the bearing in the line rollers. Once you're happy with your layout, go ahead and mark the center of your spools, cut your 8mm hole. After you've marked the gear hole, again I like to go back with a bearing. Again, I'm using a 5/16 bit, which is pretty close to 8mm. Put your 8mm bolts to the back. I did end up with 60mm in length 8mm bolts. I probably could have used a little longer bolt with this 3/4 inch board, but these should work for this purpose. The bolts are through. Now I'll put the fender washers on. Washers are on. Now you can put the bearing in the gears. Bearings are on the bottom of the gears. Don't forget your 3D printed spacer. Now you can put your 608 bearings in your spools. Now the bearings are on the spools. For my board, I'm going to put the one I wrapped clockwise up here. These two will be counterclockwise wrapped. Put your washers on. And put your M8 nuts on. Then we'll mount the rest of the idlers. Just make sure the idler is placed so that the line has a straight shot to it. I'm going to put this one right here. I'll put this one right up here. And we'll put the last one right about here. And just like on the D's, I'm going to keep the line in place with some tape for now. Now we can put the motor gears on top of the motors. These have slots in the back for hex nuts. They also have a flat spot for the motor shaft to slide in. You really only need one screw for these. I'm going to use M3 by 5mm screws. Leave them on there loose for now because you might have to adjust them up and down to fit the spool gear. Make that 8mm screws on these. All the set screws are in. Now all the gears are on the motors. Now you can mount all your motors on your motor mounts. These will also be M3 by 8mm screws. They set on there just like this. You might want to adjust your motor on the mount for plug orientation depending on where you're planning on mounting your main board. Now all the motor mounts are on. Now we'll place the motors around the board, one on each gear. You want to make sure this screw clears the top of the gear. It will actually ride in the same slot that the line does, in between the spool and the gear. So you want to adjust this gear up and down so it fits, and then tighten this screw up. I've found about a 2mm gap in between this gear and the motor works pretty well. This is the best view I can get you of how this gear fits. Once you're happy with the motor mount positions and how the gears fit on each other, go ahead and screw all these down with wood screws. I'm using number 10 cap head wood screws 3/4 of an inch long. Now the motors are mounted, the gears are in the place and turning smoothly. We're good to go. I'm going to mount my Mega somewhere in this neighborhood. I'm going to drill some holes and mount it straight through with some M3 by 30mm screws. I just ran the screws through the back. And I put some M3 nuts on the front. It doesn't have to be super tight, just something to keep it from moving around. Then you can put your ramp shield on top. I've already got my motor drivers installed. If you're using the 4988 drivers, make sure the potentiometer is facing away from the power plug. You want to check your separate drivers to make sure you're plugging them in correctly. You could fry them first time out. All 5 drivers are in place. We'll mount the ramp shield on the Mega. Now we can mount the power supply. I'm just going to drill a couple holes and zip tie it to the board. Power supply is zip tied down. Now we can plug the motors in. This one is the D spool up here in the corner. The rest of these we can choose which one they need to be. The D motor needs to go in E1, or the second extruder motor. Don't worry about for now which way you plug the motor in, because we can flip the cable if we need to turn the motor the opposite direction. There's the D motor. We'll call this one the A motor. It goes into the X slot. We'll call this one the B motor. It goes into the Y slot. And we'll call this one the C motor. It goes into the Z slot. Cable management is going to be critical with this build because we don't want to interfere with any of the lines. That's why I printed out all these cable holders, so we can tie everything down to the board so everything's nice and snug and out of the way. The cables have been managed. Now we need to tie in the ribbon cable from the mover. This will be the extruder motor, this will be the hot end, this will be the thermistor, and the fan. This is a 5-meter ribbon cable. I'm just going to use the whole thing. Resistance shouldn't be an issue. So the first 3 and the second 3 are the tripled up hot end wires. So I'll just solder those 2 together. There's the first 3 soldered, and there's the second 3 soldered. I also crimped a couple of connectors on just to give it a little cleaner install. The next 2 wires were the thermistor wires. I'm going to put a DuPont connector on those. There's the thermistor connection ready to go. The next 2 wires are the hot end fan. I'm just going to put connectors on those, and then I'll put them on the other side of this green terminal. It's a 12-volt fan. The next 4 wires are the motor wires. Those will also go into a DuPont connector. You have to be careful of the order of these. I'm using a 5-port DuPont connector because I ran out of 4s, but whatever wire you connected to the motor on the green wire needs to go all the way to the one side of the connector, and whatever wire you connected to the red wire needs to go all the way to the other side of the connector. On mine, the red wire is the red wire, and the green wire is the orange wire. We'll put that in port number 4. Next to the green wire, you can put the black wire. On this one, it's brown. And the blue wire goes next to the red wire. On this one, it's yellow. Now we've got all the connectors complete for our mover. Now we can cable it up to the ramps board. We'll start with the extruder. Goes into E0. Thermistor goes into T0. The hot end goes into D10. Then finally we'll hook the power and the hot end fan up to the right side of the green plug. That's the 5 amp side. The plug on the left is the positive, the plug on the right is negative. Then I just put the hot end fan right on top and screw it down. Then you can plug that into your ramps. We'll head out to GitHub and download the Marlin firmware for the hang printer. We'll extract all, firmware folder, hang printer Marlin, open up the hang printer Marlin INO file. You have to have the Arduino IDE. Cable up your Mega board via USB, tools, board, Arduino Mega 2560, select the COM port that you're on, and for now we'll just upload the default version. Hit upload. After the upload's complete, let's go into Pronterface. Connect up 115200 to COM port 10. Now we can power the printer on for the first time. The hot end fan came up, so that's a good sign. Now we'll do some test commands to make sure the motors are moving. Do G6, D5. Your D motor moved. Try G6A5, A motor moved. G6B5, B motor moved. G6C5, C motor moved. Now we need to make sure they're moving in the right direction. When you do a positive value, the spool should let line out. When you do a negative value, the spool should take line in. If we do G6, D -5, the D spool should turn counterclockwise. And it does not, so we'll need to flip the motor cable. Make sure to power the board off before you change the cable. We'll flip the E1 cable over, and then power the board back on. Now when you enter G6, D -5, it should turn counterclockwise. And it does. You'll want to do this for each spool. Now that the A, B, C, and D motors are turning the right way, we need to see if the extruder is turning the right way. But first, let's test heat up the hot end. I'm going to set it to 215. And the heat is rising. I'm going to set it to off for now. I'm going to load a test piece of filament into the hot end so we can test the extrusion. Make sure the hot end isn't touching anything, and then I'm going to set it to 200 degrees. Once the hot end's up to temp, I'm just going to hit the extrude button to test to make sure the extruder is turning in the right direction. Now, it is turning in the right direction. Now I'm going to test extrude 50 millimeters of filament. Looks like the extruder is working just fine. Now I'll set the hot end to off. Now the top plate and the mover are pretty much done. Now we need to move on to building a print surface, something we can print on, and the anchor parts for the A, B, and C lines. Now we'll put the V-groove bearings into the printed parts that go on the anchors. They just slide in the top. We'll use an M3x18 screw. You should have 6 of them. Now all the bearings are in. We can put some Bowden tube in the front of these pieces. You only need about 10 to 15 millimeters. The Bowden tubes are on. You're going to need some countersunk screws to mount these. I found number 6s fit right in there. Now we'll make the A, B, and C anchors. You want your printed parts on the anchor to be the same width as your mover. So you want to measure in between the two holes where the lines are mounted for each axis and space out your printed parts on the anchor like that. We'll measure in between these two holes. That's roughly 46 centimeters. It should be the same on each side of your mover. I'm just using some scrap 2x4s and some of the wood that I salvaged from the version 2 anchors to make these. So I'm just going to measure out 46 centimeters on each one of the anchor pieces. And then the lines that you measured, you want the Bowden tube to line up with that line. And we're going to put the front of the printed part flush with the front of the anchor mount. Measure 2 centimeters from the front of the mount on that line. Then you can place your wood screw. Then you can slide your printed piece on. Again, 20 millimeters from the edge of the anchor. Place your wood screw. And slide another printed piece on. You want these printed pieces to be as flush with the front of your anchors because it's going to make measuring and calibration a lot easier later. Repeat these steps for all 3 of your anchors. Now all the printed line rollers are on the anchors. Now just kind of check it against the mover and make sure they're pretty close to the same width. Those look good. Now I'm going to screw all the anchor pieces down to some flat stock. This is just to give me a little more room to put some weight down on it. Now all 3 of my anchor pieces are ready to go, and there's some spots so that I can put weight. I want to measure how high these anchors are. These are roughly 6 centimeters in height. This will be important later. Now we're done with the anchors. We can move these. I'm just going to use another piece of particle board as our build surface, but I'm going to use elevator bolts as feet so that we can level the build surface. These are 3/8 bolts. I'm just going to use a nut and a washer, and then I'll screw it through on each corner, and then put a washer and a nut on top of that. Then we can adjust it up and down. All 4 of the first nuts and washers are on. We'll just put these on each corner. Since we know that the anchors are 60 millimeters high, we'll try to start with the build surface to be 60 millimeters high. All the bolts are roughed in and in place for now. We will adjust these and set the level when we get it into its final position. And that's it. Everything's been built. Unfortunately, this was probably the easy part of this project. Next, we have to get everything set up and calibrated and ready for the first print. If you don't know, the hang printer was developed by Torbjörn Ludvigsson. Please check out his GitHub page for all the information on this project, and check out his Bounty Source campaign and consider donating to it. This could be a real game changer. If you like this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up or subscribing to my channel. If not, leave your thoughts below. We'll see you in the next hang printer video, and thanks for watching.